So today we will be looking at Islamic architecture. And I titled it The Path Toward Mecca, because Islamic architecture, its orientation is unique, kind of pilgrimage oriented toward Mecca, unlike Buddhist architecture, which is modeled after the cosmic order, and the Christian architecture oriented toward Easter, so it's mostly east-west. Islamic architecture is oriented facing the direction of Mecca. So in different parts of the world, mosques are oriented to different direction, but they all need to indicate the direction of Mecca. So let's see. So a brief history of Islam compared to Buddhism, Christianity, Taoism, and the pagan religion of the Greco-Roman world. Islam is a relatively young religion, and it started in the 7th century and founded by Prophet Muhammad. And so the Islamic calendar start with the year 622. So that's the year 1 according to the Islamic calendar. The Hijrah, which refer to the event that Muhammad flee from Mecca to Medina. He was born in Mecca, but when he starts spreading the new message, he was not well received there. So he fled to the city of Medina, and where he built up his power base and eventually took Mecca and the entire Arabian Peninsula. So that event was significant. It's kind of a turning point in the life of Prophet Muhammad, as well as the entire religion of Islam, to mark the year 1 of the Islamic calendar. So after Prophet Muhammad, the Islamic world was ruled by the so-called 4 righteous caliph. Caliph refer to the successor of Prophet Muhammad. So they were the leader of the Islamic world in the early stage, and they were elected. In the beginning, there was no dynasty. So the caliphs were elected, and by the end of this period, Islam spread from the Arabian Peninsula to the Mesopotamia and Persia, as well as Egypt. So during the conquest in the 7th century, the Umayyads built up their power base in Syria. And so there, eventually, they founded a new dynasty, and that is known as the Umayyad dynasty. And its capital is in the city of Damascus there. So by the end of the Umayyad dynasty, Islam spread further westward and eastward. To the west, it pushed into the Indus River area and came to contact with the Indian and the Chinese world. And on the west front, Western Africa became Muslim country, as well as Spain. So Spain also was under the Umayyad. It became part of the Umayyad Empire. And during those further kind of conquest, another group became prominent, and eventually they replaced the Umayyads and became the next Caliphate family, and that became known as the Abbasid Caliphate. The power base of the Abbasids is in Iraq, today's Iraq, and so their capital is in Baghdad. So Baghdad became the capital for the Islamic Caliphate, known as the Abbasid Caliphate, in the 8th century to the 10th century. So the later part of the Abbasid period was characterized by the independent movement of those provinces. So different part of the Islamic world became virtually independent. For example, Egypt was a semi-independent in the 9th century and the 10th century. So is Persia. So the Abbasid Caliph, their direct control is pretty much just in today's Iraq, in that area. So we see the Fatimid, Egypt, and the Spain was under the Umayyad hands. So during the Abbasid period, they conquered most of the land from the previous Umayyad empire, except for Spain. So Spain remained a safe haven for the Umayyads, who were defeated by the Abbasid. And after the 15th century, so a major significant event for the development of Islam, as well as the history of the world history, was the Mongol conquest. We know in the 13th century, the Mongols from the Mongolian priory conquered much of the world, and that included the Abbasid Empire. So Baghdad was captured by the Mongols. So Abbasid dynasty was ended by the Mongols. And when the Mongols, after about a century, the Mongols' rulership also declined, and those local Islamic regimes start to emerge, and that include in the Persian world, the Safavid dynasty ruled much of the Iranian and Iraqi world, while on the Western Islamic world, it was the Ottoman Turkish Empire controlled much of the Asia Minor, and also captured Constantinople in 1453, and renamed it Istanbul. So, we will look at the some of the major regimes and their representative architectural tradition. In general, Islam as an architectural culture does not have much consistency compared to, for example, Christianity, partially because of, when Islam as a religion was born, architectural tradition in different parts of the world were already fully established. So Islam basically adopted the local architectural tradition and twisted it and adjusted it according to the Islamic ritual system to fulfill their own religious need. So Islamic architecture basically was created by, adopting different architectural traditions. In Mesopotamia, Islamic architecture was heavily influenced by Mesopotamian architecture. And in the Mediterranean world, the European tradition, the Greco-Roman architectural tradition, had a great influence on the development of Islamic architecture, especially the Byzantine tradition that we looked at just a week ago. So we will see how fully established architectural traditions were adopted and adjusted for the religion of Islam. So that would be the focus of this lecture. And one consistent feature is, of course, the orientation. So that is orientation toward Mecca. So if a mosque was constructed in this part of the world, they need to be oriented to the southwestern direction. But if a mosque was constructed in this part of the world, they need to be oriented toward the southeast direction. So Mecca is the key for the architectural orientation in Muslim countries. The first extant Islamic monument is the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem was captured by the Umayyads. And when it was first captured, the holy city of Mecca and Medina was not under the Umayyad hands yet. So the Umayyad Muslim, they didn't have access to Mecca and Medina, those holy cities. They cannot fulfill that requirement to have a pilgrimage trip to visit Mecca during their lifetime. So instead, they construct Jerusalem as the third holy city. And they also claim, the Umayyads also claim that Jerusalem is the place where Prophet Muhammad started his night journey to heaven, while Mecca was the birthplace of Prophet Muhammad, and Medina was the place where Prophet Muhammad passed away. Jerusalem was the place where Prophet Muhammad started his journey to meet God, Allah. The city of Jerusalem had been a holy city for a long time. And in the Old Testament, the site on which the Dome of the Rock was built was the place where Abraham was about to sacrifice Isaac, and then, of course, replaced by a ram by God. So it was a holy place for Judaism. And this is also the place where once upon a time, the famous Temple of Solomon was built, the second, the Temple of Solomon, which was later destroyed by the Neo-Babylonians. And this was also the place where Jesus Christ was crucified. So it was also a holy site for Christianity. And then in the 7th century, by the end of the 7th century, Islam claimed the city of Jerusalem, and this very site, a holy site for Islam, and associated with also with the life of Prophet Muhammad. So on the site, before the construction of the Dome of the Rock, there was a Christian church. And before the construction of that Christian church, there was a Roman pagan temple. So the site had been reconstructed many times according to the changing, dominating religion of the city. And each reconstruction, since the Romans took the architectural materials from the older building, which were dismantled for the decoration and reconstruction of the new building. So the Christian church took the capitals and columns and beautiful marbles from the pagan Roman temple for the construction of that church. And the Dome of the Rock also, took those capitals and marbles from that, recycled church for the construction of this new monument. So there were spolia, right? Those architectural members not made for the building, but took from a previous building that is called the spolia. We know early Christian architecture had a lot of spolia, and so our early Islamic architecture include the Dome of the Rock. So the Dome of the Rock was modeled after the Byzantine martyrium that commemorating the martyrs, which often features a concentric plan with circular or octagonal plan. So the Dome of the Rock had a octagonal plan, and featuring the concentric design highlight a center. The center is illuminated by clerestory windows from the drum of a central dome, and that center was strengthened by a ambulatory, 2 layers of ambulatory. So this is very similar to St. Vital in Ravenna, constructed more than 100 years before the Dome of the Rock. So here on the left, we have the St. Vital in Ravenna, a Byzantine style architecture built in Italy, in western part of Europe. It is also a concentric plan with octagonal plan featuring those clerestory windows. There's also a dome, although in the early Christian, the Byzantine case, that dome was hidden under a second layer of timber roof, while Dome of the Rock, that dome is exposed. But they have pretty much the same plan and the same idea of interior illumination. The capitals and the marbles of the Dome of the Rock were spolia from the previous Christian church, and that previous Christian church was constructed on the ruin of a Roman temple. So those capital, some of them were half a millennium older than the building itself. So a capital like that was once built, carved for a pagan temple, and then later it was recycled into a Christian church, and now it is recycled again in this early Islamic architecture. So Dome of the Rock is quite symbolic for Islamic architecture. That is, it basically took the local architectural tradition and built upon that a local route, seek whatever is available and use those material and articulate a space and structure for their own need. In the center of the Dome of the Rock is the rock, right? So that rock was believed to bear the mark left by the hoof of Prophet Muhammad's sacred mount. So this is a proof of Prophet Muhammad's magical journey ascending to heaven, and it is venerated as a sacred relics. So the Dome of the Rock is not a mosque. It is pretty much a sacred memorial structure. It marks a sacred site. It's pretty much like the Kaaba in Mecca. It is not a mosque, but it is meant to be the center for the Islamic world, for which all mosques need to be oriented toward. All right, so it's that kind of building, comparable to the Kaaba in the holy city of Mecca. And the rock is occupying the very center of the structure. So different from the Byzantine Christian church, for which the concentric plan was kind of compromised by axiality. Dome of the Rock, there's no compromisation. It is concentric, and there is no attempt to create some kind of a linear axiality in it. The building is accessible from all four directions, so that concentric character is maintained and not compromised by additional structure or the manipulation of the wall to create some kind of axiality. So it is a concentric plan and featuring those circumambulation path in the ambulatory. Some religious requirement helped to create a unique style in Islamic art and architecture. Besides the orientation, the requirement not to create figurative images in sacred architecture contributed to the development of abstract decorative pattern in Islamic architecture. So if you compare St. Vitel's interior and the Dome of the Rock's interior, you find both of them are fully covered by decoration, but a key difference is in the Dome of the Rock, you don't find one single figurative image. There is no human figure, nor no animal figure. Muslims believe that the privilege for the creation of life, including lifelike images, was the privilege of God. So in art, one should not create those to be worshipped in sacred architecture. So there is a strong kind of iconoclastic tendency in Islamic world, which is common for many early religion. We know that in the beginning of Buddhism, there was no worship of icon. There was only worship of relics. There was also no image created for God in Christianity for a long time until the Renaissance period. Before that, we do have image of Jesus Christ and Virgin Mary, but God's image is missing. So Islam maintained that un-iconic tradition, that is icon worship. So the ceiling, the wall of Dome of the Rock were covered with floral, vegetal, and geometric, as well as calligraphic decoration without figurative images. So we have those floral motif, vegetal motif, having great geometry, and then there were Arabic inscriptions in the center, as well as on those bands. So these are the major architectural decorative motif in Islamic architecture. No human figure. Beautiful marbles, some of those butterfly marble were spolia, as well as some of the columns. So like in early Christian architecture, the columns and capitals are not consistent in style because they were recycled from pre-existing buildings. And but together they created an interior that is pretty harmonious, even though the capitals, their proportion and their style represent style of different period. And but they were, compiled together to create this very first extant Islamic architecture, following some key principles that helped to shape the tradition of Islamic architecture. The oldest extant mosque is the Great Mosque of Damascus. That was built between 705 and 715. Like the site of the Dome of the Rock, this Great Mosque of Damascus was also constructed on a pre-existing Christian site. So on site of the walled enclosure of a Roman temple and the Christian church of St. John the Baptist. So before, like the Dome of the Rock, before the mosque, there used to be the church of St. John the Baptist. And before the church of St. John the Baptist, there used to be a Roman temple. So the kind of successive change of religious context reshaped these old cities, like the city of Damascus. So the upper image shows the before the mosque, the church of John the Baptist. It was within a courtyard. It features a Latin cross plan, and it was entered from the west end and toward the crossing and toward the altar, which is located on the east side. So when the mosque was constructed, much of the wall of the church was preserved, but they needed to change the orientation. Because here, instead of a east-west orientation, as in the Christian church, they need to rebuild it following the north-south orientation. Because Damascus is located to the north of Mecca. So they need to be oriented toward south, So that was the main kind of reorientation of the pre-existing structure and for the purpose of Islam. In fact, in today's plan of the mosque, you can still observe some kind of crossing, right? So you can see a nave-like space and a crossing. While when it was used as a Christian church, it was entered from the west side and toward the kind of the eastern end where the altar is located. Now, when it was to be converted to a mosque, those walls were closed, and a new kind of gate was opened to the north, and making that short arm in the previous Latin cross shape into a main axis. And the reconstructed courtyard helped to strengthen that north-south axis and transform the orientation from the ecclesiastical one, which features east-west orientation toward the direction of the Easter. Now it was toward the orientation of Mecca, which is located to the south. So in the interior, that crossing is still highlighted, but then we got an equal arm on both sides, and the interior orientation is totally changed. But still, there is a small pavilion as a memorial for John the Baptist. It's still in. So Islam inherited a lot of share a lot of history and a belief with Old Testament, for example, as well as Christianity. For example, Muslim also acknowledge all those prophets from the Old and New Testament, including Jesus. But what is different is, according to Islam, Prophet Muhammad is the final messenger and the most significant prophet. So Prophet Muhammad is the prophet of all prophets. So that's a major difference. That doesn't mean those prophets from the biblical history were no longer admired. So they are still preserved in the reconstructed mosque. So a comparison between the Great Mosque of Damascus with the old Church of St. Peter's, the old Church of St. Peter's in Rome, shows both similarity and difference. Both of them in the Mediterranean world features a kind of basilica prototype. Both of them were developed from the Roman basilica architectural, prototype. But while in the Roman basilica, the orientation is irrelevant. You can either enter the basilica from the end or from the side. While in Christian architecture, basilica was rebuilt to be entered primarily from the end. While in the Great Mosque of Damascus, it is reoriented to be specifically entered from the side and for specific orientation. So there are other architectural features that identify Islamic architecture, making Islamic architecture standing out from other architectural traditions. The most important is the Chibla Wall. Chibla Wall refer to a wall that indicate the direction of Mecca, right? So one needs to face the Chibla Wall to pray, because Chibla Wall tells you which direction is Mecca. And inside the prayer hall, in the Great Mosque of Damascus, that is the Chibla Wall, right? Located in the south of the building. And the Chibla Wall is the most ornately decorated wall in an interior. It, craftsmen use the best material, most beautiful decoration to decorate that wall. And there are two architectural elements in that wall to further clearly mark the wall from the rest of the directions. One is called the Mihrab, and Mihrab is a niche in the center of the Chibla Wall, and that is often features an arched surface and highly decorated. So it is like an empty niche. It's very symbolic for the iconoclastic gesture of Islam, as if previous Christian church might have a statue inside that niche, and now that statue is taken out and just using that abstract niche to suggest the holiness of the religion. So it's basically an empty, highly decorated niche that is called mihrab. Another element is called a mimbar. Mimbar is a pulpit, usually next to the mihrab, to the right of mihrab, for Friday sermon. But no imam was to occupy that seat, because on the top of the stair, that seat is also symbolic. That is a symbolic seat reserved for the prophet. So the actual leader of the recitation of the prayer is under the stair. So that mimbar usually features a flight of stair with a pulpit on the top, covering a seat, covering an empty seat. So basically, the mimbar is an elevated empty seat representing Prophet Muhammad, and the mihrab is an empty niche representing God, Allah. So that is on this wall. So you see there's a little niche there, and that is what we are looking at. Basically, yeah, that is the mimbar, right? That's the stair, and that is the pavilion under which there's an empty seat. So next to it is the mihrab, and that is the pavilion for John the Baptist. Structurally speaking, like early Christian architecture, the Great Mosque of Damascus also combined load-bearing masonry wall with post and lintel roof structure. So it has a wooden roof, and with masonry wall, and the crossing was marked by 4 arches. So there is a kind of a tension between directionality and axiality, right? The geometric axis of the building is east-west, but the ritual axis is north and south. And that there is a certain tension in that, but the reconstruction of the space helped to establish that Islamic axis by lining the primary architectural element along that central axis. That include a minaret, which is just next to the entrance. Minaret is the place where the calling for prayer was shout out. And so when people hear that calling, and because of the height of the minaret, people can see it, using it as a guide to find the entrance to the mosque. And once prayers enter from that gate, they found themselves automatically facing the direction of Mecca, because that gate is located to the north of the main prayer hall. So the minaret and the main entrance is located on that north-south axis. Then in the middle of the courtyard is the fountain pavilion for ablution, for purification, before entering the prayer hall. And then the main entrance to the prayer hall, the crossing, and finally the mihrab and the minbar. So all those major key mosque elements are located along this north-south axis. Like the Byzantine architecture, the Great Mosque of Damascus also faces a challenge to put a dome on top of a square bay. And the solution here is not using pendentif, but using squinch, right? So this is the second solution. Basically, the square was first transformed into an octagon by 4 additional diagonal beams. And the thick wall of that octagon was close enough to a circle to support a circular drum. And that circular drum was, of course, to support a dome, right? So under those diagonal support are half domes that hold up the diagonal beam. And that was the beginning of a very important Islamic architectural feature called the Mukarnas. So you will see that term later in some future slide. This might not be considered a Mukarnas yet, but Mukarnas was based on the same principle. If those diagonals were further supported by smaller vault, and then it might be called a Mukarnas. So Mukarnas was based on, the use of small size vault to support a large size vault, and those vault were also making the transition from a square to a circle. And in this case, it's only one step transition, octagon. So if you further divide it and support those from underneath, then more and a smaller vault would be needed, and you would create a honeycomb-like structure. And that would be called Mukarnas. But now let's focus on Damascus, the very beginning of all these kind of Islamic feature first. The minaret, which is at the entrance, the major minaret is at the entrance, but there are smaller ones symmetrically located on the corner. Like Byzantine architecture, the Mosque of Damascus also used mosaic to decorate the significant part, especially those facade located along the central axis. So this is the entrance to the prayer hall, and it is quite elaborately decorated with mosaics. And here we have the fountain pavilion, and they are all lined up along the central axis, pointing to the direction of Mecca. The interior also features mosaic decoration. A lot of them were made by Byzantine craftsmen, depicting naturalistic landscape and fantastic architectural scenes. Human and animal figures are absent. So they concentrate on those floral, vegetal, and abstract patterns. And as a result, we have the word arabesque, which refer to patterns like this. It's really complicated, but not mimicking anything in nature. They are basically very complicated geometric patterns. So those were from the Umayyad dynasty. So both of these two earliest extant Islamic architecture were from the Umayyad dynasty. The Abbasids shifted further to the Eastern world, right, to the Orient. Their capital is in the city of Baghdad, and there the Islamic architecture was constructed very differently than those Islamic architecture, from the coastal area, which were highly influenced by the Mediterranean tradition, right? Damascus, for example, and Jerusalem. So those were all highly influenced by the Byzantine architectural tradition. But here in Baghdad, a monument built during the Abbasid period had great tie with the Mesopotamian architectural tradition. And this is the great mosque at Samara. The city of Samara served as a capital for the Caliph during a very brief period. The city was later abandoned and buried under sand. So as a result, it was remarkably preserved because there is no modern city built on top of it. We know very little about the city of Baghdad from the Umayyad, from the Abbasid period, because there is a modern metropolitan city of Baghdad on top of it. But Samara had been abandoned and not occupied again. So we have the archaeological record of Samara. This is the great mosque there. It was very big. But just from this very ruined condition of this mosque, we can see it is very different from the Damascus mosque, very different from the kind of Byzantine influenced mosque. First here, we have a concentric kind of a courtyard plan. There's a central courtyard. There's also an outer layer of courtyard. And then there's a minaret, but that minaret bear no resemblance to a Christian tower or whatsoever. But it bear great similarity to the ancient Mesopotamian architecture. For example, on the upper left corner is an example of Mesopotamian architecture from the beginning of this class. That is the oval temple at Khafajeh, which was built, 3,000 years before Islam. And that there it features those double concentric courtyard layout. And it also used platform to elevate the ground toward the sacred center, right? So that double courtyard bear great similarity to the ancient architectural tradition in the region. This is the inner courtyard of the Samara Mosque from the 9th century. So the courtyard is surrounded by hypostyle halls from all 4 directions, but on the Mecca direction, which is to the south, on the south as well, southwest, because Baghdad is located to the northeast of Mecca, right? So that southwestern wall has the largest roofed space, because that is a major prayer hall. And the minaret is located on the opposite direction. So same idea as the Damascus Mosque. Basically, the visibility of the minaret and the sound of the minaret would attract prayer, and they follow that tower and would be able to find entrance. And entering that entrance, they would be facing Mecca and be looking at the main prayer hall. And entering that main prayer hall, they would be able to see the Chibla Wall, where the Mihrab and the Minbar is located. So in that sense, it's similar in terms of spatial orientation. And that is, by the way, the Mihrab in the, it's right there, right? In the center of the Chibla Wall, the Mihrab. So the minaret on the opposite direction of the Chibla Wall features a spiraling kind of stair continuously from the ground all the way to the top. And the top is a pavilion. And that pavilion is a place where calling for prayer is shouted out. Now that looks familiar, right? That minaret. That minaret bear great similarity to the ziggurat. Ziggurat from 2000 BCE were piled up with platforms on top of platforms, while the older one often has, features 3 layers of platform. The later one, especially those from the Babylonian period and the Assyrian period, for example, the ziggurat from the palace of Sargon in Khorsabad, which was to the north of Baghdad in the same region, also features a continuous spiraling passage ramp that allows the chariot to ascend from the bottom to all the way to the top. So this minaret is basically very similar, to the Babylonian ziggurat. The only difference is here it's the circular plan replaced the square plan, but it is also basically a spiraling ramp from the bottom to the top, right? So again, the point here is Islamic architecture was built upon local tradition, and those local traditions sometimes had thousands of years of history before the arrival of Islam in the region. And most naturally, Islamic architecture took local material for the construction of mosque. In the Mediterranean world, like in Jerusalem or Damascus, they use stone. And here they use sun-dried bricks. Right? So majority of the wall were basically adobe, and then the surface they use brick and also use ceramic pin to kind of waterproof the surface. So this is the same method as the ancient Mesopotamian architecture. And the requirement of Islam only allow them to, use geometric decoration. So there is a missing a figurative decoration compared to both Christian architectural tradition and the ancient Mesopotamian traditions. Now, during the Abbasid period, Baghdad and Iraq was the center of the Islamic world. Great scholars and scientists were working in the city of Baghdad. So it was one of the major city and one of the major centers of civilization in medieval world. Next to maybe the city of Chang'an in China and the great city of Constantinople in the Byzantine world. So Baghdad and Iraq was the center of fashion, including architecture. So we see during that period, architecture even built in the Mediterranean region were following the example of Mesopotamian architectural tradition. This is the Mosque of Ibn Tulun in Cairo. Cairo is, it belonged to the Mediterranean world, right? It was a province, it was a vassal state of the Alexander's empire, the Greek empire. It was also a province of the Roman Empire. So it was part of the Mediterranean Greco-Roman world for a long time. But the Mosque of Ibn Tulun followed the example of the mosque at Samara in the formation of a double courtyard and the location of the minaret next to the entrance and the featuring of a spiraling ramp in that minaret. So also, there are halls and columns from all direction, and only the Chibla direction has a Chibla Wall, Mihrab, Mimbar, as well as a larger prayer hall. So all that looks just like the Great Mosque at Samara. The size is much smaller than the Iraqi example, but it's modeled after that. The material is different, right? Ibn Tulun used local material, while in the style and the shape of the courtyard, it followed the Iraqi model. Material, they used the local material. Instead of using brick, they used stone. It is in this Islamic architecture we found the earliest example of pointed arch, right? Pointed arch. The Romans used semicircular arch, all right, geometric arch. Geometric arch has great restriction because the height is limited. The height is pre-decided. You know, for a geometric arch, the height of the arch can only be half the span, right? Because it's semicircular, right? The height is the radius. That is not very flexible, but pointed arch is very flexible. You know, you can build whatever height needed for a set span. And the pointed arch would be explored further and would become the base for the development of Romanesque and Gothic architecture. But its first use is in the Islamic architecture of Ibn Tulun. This is from the 9th century. It is centuries ahead of the Romanesque and Gothic, which was primarily from the 11th century to the 13th century. Pointed arch with stretched height also performed better structurally than the Roman circular arch, because when the height is stretched, that arch, the sideward push is minimized, and the downward load is primary. So it is also structurally better. And here we also found some of the architectural motifs that would also be very popular in the future Gothic and Romanesque Christian architecture, including the rose window-like rondelle. And these are the blind rondelle. It's not a window, it's just a circular decoration on the wall, but it bears great resemblance to the future rose window, which would become such a unique and characteristic feature for Gothic architecture. Next example, we are going to look at the Great Mosque of Cordoba. So this is in Spain. You know, southern Spain remained Islamic well into the 15th century. So Cordoba was the capital for the Umayyad Spain. You know, Umayyad remained Spain remained a Umayyad domain during the Abbasid period. So there, the mosque combined the kind of European architectural tradition in the construction of Islamic mosque. And here, what I wanted to highlight is the fashion of expansion in Islamic architecture. They usually follow a very regular core, but expand as needed to cover bigger and bigger area. The architecture grows. So originally it was a mosque that is not much bigger than the Great Mosque at Damascus, you know, featuring a southern Chibla Wall and a prayer hall with a lot of columns. And there we have the Mihrab, right? But for each city, for each Muslim city in the ancient world, there is usually just one Friday mosque, and that Friday mosque is like the major mosque for that city. And during the Friday prayer, a mosque in a city was meant to be able to accommodate the entire adult male population of that entire city. So as the city population grows, the mosque, the main mosque, the Friday mosque also needs to be expanded. So Cordoba Mosque experienced that expansion in a quite a dramatic way, right? So it was, first expanded following the Chibla orientation, and eventually another section was added next to it. So eventually today, it became an enormous covered area. And once standing inside, one felt lost because you were not able to see the end of the forest of column. So surrounded by those columns, like a vast sea or a forest. The boundary walls are so far away that it's hard to realize, under a room with boundary. So that's the interior. It's basically a lot of columns. It also used spolia. Some of the capitals were from the pre-existing Christian architecture. So here, the building also features kind of arched masonry supporting system in combination with a timber roof. The roof was constructed with wood. But the supporting columns spring out to form those quite flamboyant arches, and some of them features double layer, which is of course totally redundant. It's not structurally necessary, although they might provide extra kind of support consolidation in between those high columns. But the main consideration is here is not structural, but formal and aesthetic, creating the beauty of this kind of this arches, which with alternating colors create that kind of band under the ceiling and expand upward. The column is thinner than the wall and arch they were supporting. And here we also have, just a few characteristic Islamic architectural features. One is the polychrome masonry, basically use stone of different color to create patterns. Again, without being allowed to create figurative decoration, the creative energy was channeled for the creation of these abstract patterns. And not only two-dimensional abstract patterns, but also those three-dimensional spatial patterns. And also the Horseshoe Arch is also a trademark of Islamic architecture. So here we have the arches, not a geometric shape, but kind of swelling in the middle and creating that kind of horseshoe shape. The central part, which was also the oldest part of the Cordoba Mosque, was kind of a hierarchically constructed, delineating an elite area for the aristocrats to pray. The area immediately in front of the Mihrab, for example, is masonry. So the rest of them are timber, except for this part. This part also is the heart. It's the axis part. And there we have 3 domes rising above the rest of the roof, delineating a more elevated area for the rulers and aristocratic family. So this is a detail of that area. The 3 cupolas on the top. And there is also a direct passage for caliph from the palace to the mosque's transept to that area, right? So there's kind of direct access to that restricted area. And the rest can be used by, general prayers. So this is an elite structure, and there is a hierarchical differentiation of interior space. So toward that center, architecture became more elaborate, more ornate. The entire interior is pretty ornate, but toward that area, the arches became even more flamboyant, right? So those double layers split into more complicated shapes. The horseshoe grow into a flower shape, and the simple 2-color pattern was also replaced by a more elaborate combination of colors and more detailed carving of patterns on the surfaces. And behind it is the mihrab, right? So that's a mihrab, and that is the bay right in front of that, which could be referred to as the transept. So if you can almost see a cross shape there, right? And that transept has 3 domed ceiling, the masonry domed ceiling. And this ceiling features ribbed dome. So they had ribs. Byzantine craftsmen were hired to decorate the interior of these domes. It was an innovative structure. It used interpenetrating ribs to support a dome above a square, right? So it has a square bay, and the square bay was first transformed into octagon using squinches. But then from the base of that octagon, ribs were built to make connection every other point on the octagonal base, and thus created a woven structure of ribs. And that rib create a smaller octagon, and that octagon is covered by a dome, and that small dome is directly located on top of that. So it's based on the squinch principle for the transition between a square plan and a circular roof, but it uses those ribs to make further transition. And those ribs allowed great opportunity, which is not taken advantage of here in this Islamic architecture, but would be explored in future Baroque architecture. Windows can be opened there, right? Under those ribs. Windows can be opened there to create light from the ceiling. And that is what Baroque architecture in the 17th century would explore. But here, these ribbed dome, another key feature for future Gothic architecture was experimented in Islamic architecture. We mentioned 2 of these elements that was seeded in these Islamic architecture. One is a pointed arch, another is this ribbed dome, and they would be most prominent features for Gothic architecture, but they first appeared in Islamic architecture before the year 1000. So I'm going to give you a break.